Hi, this is Sierra Christie, and today I will be discussing Amish subgroups. So, starting with a little introduction, within the Amish community, there are various religious and cultural elements that differentiate them from society. These elements can be defined as divisions, sects, movements, and affiliations that account for the entirety of the Amish community and continue to expand today. Callers explained that at the opening of the 20th century, there were 42 geographically distinct Amish settlements in North America, representing 3 or 4 affiliations, groups defined by shared views and practices. By 2012, the number of settlements had swelled to 493, and the number of affiliations had multiplied to more than 40. If the smaller subgroups within some affiliations are counted, the number of identifiable cohorts rises above 65, not including the more than 130 fairly independent congregations that lack a firm relationship to a wider affiliation. Although a multitude of Amish identities have cropped up over the 20th century, members of 2,000 church districts still broadly recognize one another as Amish. So we won't be discussing all of those subgroups, but we will be talking about 10 of them today. So the differences in these groups varies from things such as the practice, clothing, use of technology, and education. Although these are only a few major points, each Amish subgroup can vary by incredibly minor details, and it would not be feasible to break down each group individually. Instead, we will discuss a few of the major issues and divisions amongst the community to better understand what distinguishes the Amish society within, and specifically 10 of those Amish subgroups. So the first one we're going to talk about is the New Order. The New Order Amish are considered the most progressive or liberal amongst the Amish communities. They allow a greater use of electricity, but still use horse and buggy for transportation, as well as sticking to the traditional Amish attire. Oddly enough, the New Order Amish are considered more strict than the Old Order, and disputes among these groups caused their Great Divide many years ago. Several reasons that caused the division between Old and New were that the New Order wanted more open-minded religious programs like Bible studies, youth activities, and Sunday schools. The split with the Old Order Amish happened, in part, because accusations that the New Order possessed a holier-than-thou attitude and their emphasis on moral purity. So there's quite a few differences between the New Order and the Old Order, both in church and lifestyle. In church services, they have outreach and mission projects. They include Sunday school and are less strict with shunning. In lifestyle, they have a greater allowance for technology, specifically for business purposes. They prohibit the use of tobacco and alcohol, which the Old Order does allow, and their courting practices emphasize purity. There is no higher education. Both the New Order and the Older stop education at 8th grade. So next we're going to talk about the Old Order. Old Order Amish are considered mainstream, and the term applies to a large number of various Amish groups. They forbid the use of home electricity, motor vehicles, and still use the form of traditional Amish dress. Old Order Amish also take communion twice a year, forbid all use of violent force, practice foot washing as a church ordinance, and reject assurance of salvation. Baptism and obedience to the church are both rules, and standards of the community are considered necessary for salvation. So a little bit about the Old Order lifestyle. The Old Order Amish are commonly compared to the Old Order Mennonites and share similar lifestyles. Farming is completed without the use of technology such as tractors. Instead, they use horses or mules. This is kind of where this common term came from as horsepower, and they use this to pull their machinery. Some of the groups allow for the use of tractors just without rubber tires. No electricity, which includes the use of telephones, radio, TV, and no recorded music is permitted. Some phones are allowed at the edge of the property for business use or emergency. There's also limitations on the use of radio. Basically, only weather radios are permitted. So their church meetings are held specifically in members' homes. The men and women are segregated at the church meetings, meaning that women and children sit on one side and the men and boys sit on the other. Instruments are not permitted, and the ministry consists of volunteers, and they do not receive any compensation for their services. Shunning is also strongly enforced, and we discussed this earlier in class, but shunning is basically when a member of the church goes against church rules and they are considered to be living in sin because of this. A shunned person's name is publicly announced to the community, and all members of that community are expected to participate in the shunning, meaning that if they don't also shun the person, they could face similar consequences and possibly be shunned themselves. So the Old Order attire for both women and men varies amongst affiliations, but for the Old Order Amish, they stick to simple and traditional dress. Men wear button-down shirts, solid colors, suits with suspenders and no lapels, and straw or black-rimmed hats. Only the married men will grow their beards and are forbidden to have mustaches. Women also stick to the plain and solid color clothes with a full skirt and long sleeves. The long sleeves and skirt should be no shorter than mid-calf. They also have the option of just wearing a plain dress with the addition of an apron over the top. Jewelry for both men and women is also not permitted. Both girls and women aren't permitted to cut their hair at any point. So their hair is usually worn in a simple bun to keep it getting out of the way from doing their chores. Both women and girls also wear head coverings in several colors and styles that represent what group they're a part of. They still represent simplicity and only slightly vary in design per group. Here's just an example of kind of the Old Order attire. You can see the darker colors. The men have beards and the younger men don't yet. The women are wearing their head coverings. The children in this picture aren't wearing shoes, but you can see that the men and women are also both wearing black shoes. So just to show a graph, or a map rather, of the influence the Old Order has on North America today. This is just a map showing in the year of 2000 the popularity throughout the United States. It's clear that this subgroup mainly lies in our home state of Ohio, northern Missouri, Pennsylvania, southern Iowa, Michigan, and northern Indiana. So next we're going to talk about the Beachy Amish. The Beachy Amish Mennonite group is considered one of the most distinct factions among the subgroups. Although they forbid the use of radio and TV, they do allow the use of English in their church services, electricity in homes, and also the use of automobiles. Their structure as a community is very loose, meaning that their groups greatly vary in their practice. Some are considered more conservative and others are more relatable to the modernized groups. They also participate in missionary work around the globe and consider themselves one of the evangelical orientation. Although they vary greatly in both practice and doctrine, are loosely affiliated and move from one congregation to the next, they are considered the Amish group, whom is most likely to uphold the true biblical gospel of salvation by grace alone, through faith alone. So a little bit about their education and church services. From an educational standpoint, Beachy Amish seem to follow their members to receive higher education past the 8th grade and so forth. So they can go past the 8th grade, even doing possibly college education, but this varies among groups. Unlike previously discussed affiliation, the groups do not have segregated seating while attending church services and do allow some instruments. So both men and women, boys and girls, can all sit amongst one another. It's also much easier for community members to rejoin the church or fellowship after being excommunicated. About their lifestyle and attire, they're mostly similar to the old order lifestyle except for a few things. Some allow for the usage of instruments and others do not allow any at all. Groups are often less strict on the use of technology for things like movies and smartphones. Generally, smartphones are monitored as well as movies, so as long as it's like appropriate and clean, then it's okay. The attire is very similar to the old order as well, except for the fact that they allow children to wear more embellishments. Both men and women wear the solid fabrics, and there are less restrictions on what men can wear specifically, such as suspenders and hats. So here's an example about how the children dress differently. You can see that these boys are wearing button-down shirts. It looks like some of them have jeans on. They're not in the typical, dark colored attire. So they're definitely more laid back than other Amish groups. The next group is the intermediate and moderate conservative Mennonites. This group is known for being less strict as previously discussed conservative groups. They were previously a part of a larger group and separated based on the fact that they allowed for the use of more technology like the internet. Groups that followed the same mindset and withdrew, forming smaller communities, include the groups Midwest Mennonite Fellowship, Bethel Fellowship, and many others. The intermediate and moderate conservative Mennonites are similar to conservative groups with a few differences So one of the things they're different by is their attire. Men are still required to wear a button-down shirts to church services, but are not required to do so during their daily activities. Although this is less strict, most men still wouldn't wear shorts or bold patterns. There are no restrictions on whether a man has a beard or not, or how neatly it is kept. Women's attire is simple, but it's not exactly the same as a cape dress. They're allowed to wear bolder colors and larger prints. Women's hairstyles are the same as previously discussed, either bun or braided, but they're allowed to trim it as long as it's still kept at a long length. Almost all the women wear head coverings, but they are less noticeable and smaller. The choice of footwear for both men and women is by choice, although most attend church in black shoes. Jewelry is not permitted for either men or women, including a wedding band. Church services are held in simple buildings that generally have a few or more comfort factors like seating. Instruments are occasionally allowed during service depending on the specific group. Revivals, mission groups, and outreach services are held regularly and encouraged. Excommunication doesn't happen very often and is easier for members to rejoin if it does happen. Generally, both men and women and children are allowed to sit with one another as opposed to segregated seating like in the other subgroups. Church services are more passionate and allow for impulsive worship, unlike quiet prayer. So, talking about lifestyle and education, both TV and radio are permitted, which is definitely different than the other groups. Almost all instruments are allowed. Appropriate movies are permitted as well as the internet. There are very limited restrictions on vehicles, and many groups actually don't have any restrictions at all. Education is very similar to the Beachy Amish in a sense that they have their own schools, but some also choose to homeschool instead. It's common that children attend schools for longer periods of time, and some also allow for their children to pursue higher education as long as it's to become a nurse or a doctor. This is not very common among the groups, but it has happened before. So next we'll talk about the conservative Mennonites. They're more traditional amongst the Anabaptist or Mennonite groups, but are not considered old order. The majority of conservative Mennonite churches have an Amish background rather than Mennonite. Many who are part of this subgroup have telephones, use electricity and computers, and they also operate automobiles. Religious practices such as Sunday school are enforced as well as revival meetings, but they run their own Christian schools. Similar to the Old and New Order with a few minor differences, their schools are simple traditional buildings that are run by the church and are also taught by church members up until the 8th grade. As conservative Mennonites are a bit more progressive, some groups are beginning to provide education up to the 12th grade and are also permitted to pursue higher education only if it's to become a nurse or a doctor. Again, this is not common among most groups, but it has happened on occasion. Their church services are held in simple traditional buildings built by the community. Missions, outreaches, and Sunday schools, which is similar to the New Order, are also part of their services. Instruments are forbidden and revivals are held on a regular basis. Men and boys sit on one side of the room, whereas women and girls sit on the other, so the church services are segregated. Services are very routine, where members enter in silence and perform worship afterwards. Excommunication is enforced instead of shunning, and this means that if someone does not obey the rules and or standards of the community, they are excommunicated. Essentially, this means that they are put out of fellowship and will not receive any greetings from any of the members. They are still allowed to attend service, but are encouraged to do whatever is necessary to rejoin the church. So in other words, the other members of the community are basically told to ignore them. So men's attire is plain with solid colors or occasional plaids. Dark suits without lapels and suspenders are worn. Hats are not permitted aside from weather protection. So this is the first group that we've seen where they are distinctively told that they cannot wear hats at all, besides if they're outside working and it's raining or whatever. Beards are also not considered mandatory regardless of their marital status, but if a man does have a beard, it has to be kept trimmed and tidy, and mustaches are also forbidden. Women's attire is plain with simple patterns and maybe some colors, but as long as they don't draw any specific attention to the person wearing them, but this varies per group. The sleeves are required to be past the elbow and a full skirt no shorter than mid-calf. After making their confession of faith, all women are required to wear head coverings. The styles and colors vary by group, but are also generally very subtle and plain. Jewelry is forbidden for both men and women, including wedding bands, and both wear plain black shoes and black stockings, which are mandatory in public. So here's just an example of conservative Mennonite attire. You can see it's very different from the general dark and black or navy kind of dress wear. There's a lot of color, and some of the dresses have patterns as well. So next we're going to talk about some of the groups that aren't fairly known. The theological Mennonites, which are generally identified as Mennonites, but they still believe in baptism, pacifism, and a strong work ethic like the Amish. They don't have any written standards, and thus aren't easily distinguished from other Amish groups or Christian groups. Women who are part of this subgroup do not generally wear head coverings on a daily basis. They only wear them to church worship services. Also, similar to other groups, they only allow for both male leaders and pastors. So theological Mennonites refer to their practices as ordinances or acts instead of the word sacrament. They are recognized as the 7 biblical ordinances that include baptism, on confession of faith, the Lord's Supper, washing of the saints' feet, the holy kiss, which is not very common, marriage, ordination of elders, bishops, ministers, preachers of the word, and anointing with oil for healing. So the next group we're going to talk about isn't exactly defined as a subgroup. They're called the Reformist Amish. As opposed to previously discussed groups, this group does not represent a specific group, but instead represents clusters of Amish congregations coming from mainstream Old Order groups. They are defined as actively promoting moral reforms and avoid any doctrinal, technological, or religious reforms that will result in separation from their Old Order affiliations. Reformist reform movements are similar to medieval Catholicism in the way that corruption was recognized in professing Christian culture. It was attempted to be called back to holiness and did not challenge any doctrines coming out of Rome. They believed that the Amish should live strict moral lives and remain committed to whatever sect they are in. The next group is the Indiana Swiss Amish. Arriving in the mid-1800s from Switzerland and nearby surrounding areas, the ancestors of this subgroup have very different origins than those Amish in the majority of North America. They are more conservative than the Pennsylvania German ethnicity Amish in today's society that is very common in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Both the Swiss Amish in the Allen and Adams communities speak various distinct dialects than that of the Pennsylvania German Amish settlements. The Swiss Amish practice yodeling. They have diverse burial customs, and they also only travel by open buggy. They basically come from the same basis of the Old Order Amish, but there's a few differences. So some differences between them and the Pennsylvania Dutch communities are that they only use open-top buggies. They practice yodeling, which has never been seen in any other community. Their dialect is slightly different than that of the typical Amish, although any non-Amish person probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The Swiss Amish rarely intermarry with Pennsylvania German Amish, and their last names are a lot more distinct. They're the only group that mainly sticks to only marrying within the community, so that's something that's not very common. They're also more conservative in terms of technology compared to Old Order Amish. And as far as burial customs, specifically, they use wooden markers to indicate the place of burial. Another group is the Schwarzentrooper. This group is considered to be the ultra-conservative and originally broke off from an Old Order group. They are more restrictive regarding technology and clothing, and they broke away from the Old Order because they rejected the idea of members accepting those who did not want the Amish lifestyle after being shunned, as opposed to the Old Order, whom would be willing to restore personal relationships with someone who has left the Amish. So basically, they were not willing to accept anyone after they were shunned. That person would be done forever. So that was all of the 10 subgroups that I chose. There was only one class question, and it was, how well do different groups of Amish get along? So basically, I couldn't find much information about this on the internet, but from what I've read, different Amish groups and affiliations tend to get along very well. Some of them do intermarry, as we've discussed, and some of them don't. Most often, the members of a community remain within that community, and they don't seek partnership with those in other communities. So generally, them getting along is not really an issue. Most of the subgroups originated from the fact that the members did not agree with their leaders and rules or standards of the community was saying. So you could say that originally the community itself did not get along well, and that's basically what caused all of these subgroups. So some vary as far as like their opinion on technology or education. So a member would stay in their community and still maintain kindness and their religious beliefs towards anyone else that was part of a different community. So I'm not exactly sure of the answer specifically, but I do believe that they would all get along just based on their religious beliefs. And I think that intermarrying is not something that's very common, so they could definitely interact with one another outside of each community with different groups. So the last slide is just a page showing my sources. First one is for all the information and research that I obtained and used for this presentation. And the second one is just links for the pictures that I used. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. Learned a ton from doing this, and I hope that you guys did as well. Thank you.